You should be home resting instead of creeping people out at the park." Dylan's voice rang louder than he intended. Several heads turned. The summer heat clung to his skin as he tried to shake off the awkwardness. On the faded white bench, the old black man remained still, his gaze steady despite his cloudy eyes. "What?" Dylan half laughed, turning to his friends. "Am I wrong? Guy's sitting out here in a torn-up army jacket, talking to himself. He's either lost or dangerous." A woman walking her dog stopped nearby. Her voice was calm but sharp. "Do you even know who he is?" "Should I?" "That man is Sergeant George H. Carter, the last surviving member of the 761st Tank Battalion." December 19th, 1944, Bastogne, Belgium. The wind cut sharper than any blade Private George H. Carter had ever known. It whistled through the Ardennes forest like a ghost, rattling branches, lifting loose snow, and stinging skin right through layers of wool and khaki. His breath came out in thick clouds as he peered through the periscope of the Sherman tank, squinting for movement in the white silence ahead. "Anything?" Corporal Darnell asked from below, nursing a bruised shoulder. "Nothing but snow and tree trunks." George exhaled, his voice low and even. "But they're out there. I can feel it." The 761st Tank Battalion had been called in as reinforcements by General Patton himself, though not out of respect, more like desperation. The all-black unit had trained harder, longer, and under more scrutiny than any white division, but they'd been kept from the front lines until now. Patton had no choice but to send them into the Battle of the Bulge. "Guess they finally figured black boys can bleed too," Darnell muttered bitterly. George didn't respond. The anger sat in him like a coiled wire, tight, silent, always ready to snap. But he had learned to hold it. He'd held it when the quartermaster refused to give them winter boots, when white officers called them mules, when he saw his friend Elijah get slapped by a superior for saluting wrong. And now, in the frozen hell of Bastogne, he held it again. The radio crackled to life. "All tanks, hold position. Recon reports movement to the northeast. Prepare for engagement." George tapped the side of the periscope and adjusted his seat. "Darnell, load up. Stay sharp." Darnell grunted and began sliding a 75mm shell into the chamber. The metal clanked like a death bell. Suddenly, a flash, a muzzle flare in the trees. Then the crack of gunfire. George ducked. "Incoming!" The tank shook violently as artillery rained down. Trees splintered. Snow turned red. "Return fire!" someone yelled over the radio. George swung the turret toward the flash and fired. The recoil punched his shoulder, but he didn't stop. Another shell, another fireball. Then silence, broken only by the soft hiss of melting snow on hot metal. "Think we got him," Darnell breathed. George didn't reply. Through the smoke, he saw something. A figure stumbling, German uniform, blood on the chest. Then a second figure. Closer. It was Sergeant Billings, a white officer from another company. George opened the hatch and climbed out into the cold, waving. "Sergeant, you okay?" Billings stared at him blankly, then narrowed his eyes. "You stay in your tank, soldier," Billings growled. "We don't need no heroics from your kind." George's blood chilled harder than the wind. He clenched his jaw, but nodded. "Yes, sir." That night, the battalion lost 6 men. George was nearly one of them. January 1945, somewhere near Strasbourg, the snow melted, but the weight of Bastogne didn't. Inside a small stone farmhouse temporarily converted to barracks, George sat alone, polishing the casing of a shell with a worn rag. He'd saved his crew from an ambush last week, dragging Darnell and 2 others out of a burning tank. His arms were still sore, his coat singed. He hadn't even told his mother in the letter. The next morning, a crate arrived. No fanfare, just a folded piece of paper. Awarded Bronze Star for heroism under fire. He tucked it into his duffel bag without a word. Late 1945, Fort McPherson. Georgia back home, everything was different, and somehow exactly the same. The train that brought George home was met with banners for the white soldiers. George walked out with his duffel on his back and no one to greet him. Not even a bus for Negro soldiers. He hitched a ride from a farmer with a half-dead pickup who asked him 3 times if he was really a soldier. In Atlanta, he stood in line at the VA. They told him his paperwork was incomplete. GI Bill? Apply again next quarter. Housing? Sorry, full. He watched 3 white boys in line behind him receive vouchers. At night, George unfolded his uniform and medals, then slowly folded them again, placed them in a cedar box, and shoved it under the bed. Years later, 1977, Charlotte, North Carolina. George Carter became a mechanic. Not by choice, just what was available. He married, had a daughter, lost his wife to cancer, lost his daughter to a move up north. Now in his early 50s, he found peace in routine. Every morning, he walked to the park bench across from the duck pond, his wife's favorite place. He wore the same jacket, frayed and worn. Inside, a pocket still held a faded photo of his tank crew. Sometimes he whispered to them, to Darnell, to Elijah, to her. People passed. Most didn't look twice. A few crossed the path to avoid him. Until one afternoon, a boy with a camera. And then a joke. And then Dylan Callahan couldn't stop replaying the woman's words in his head. That man is Sergeant George H. Carter, the last surviving member of the 761st Tank Battalion. He hadn't even known there was a 761st Tank Battalion. By the time he got back to his dorm, the guilt had settled into his chest like wet cement. He kicked off his shoes, tossed his camera bag onto the desk, and sat at his laptop. His fingers hovered over the keyboard for a few seconds before typing, 761st Tank Battalion. The search results filled the screen. The 761st Tank Battalion, nicknamed the Black Panthers, was an all-black armored unit that fought in World War II under General Patton. They were the first African-American tank unit to see combat in U.S. military history. Patton called them tough fighters, and they served with distinction across France, Belgium, and Germany from 1944 to 1945. Dylan leaned in, eyes scanning the page. There was a photo, sepia-toned, with a dozen young black men standing atop a Sherman tank. One of them looked familiar. He clicked. The caption read, Private George H. Carter, far right, Bastogne, 1944. Dylan's breath caught. The man in the photo was 20, maybe 21. Tall, proud, smiling, eyes clear and defiant. That couldn't be the same man who sat on the park bench muttering to himself, but it was. Dylan pulled out his phone and opened the camera roll. There it was, today's photo. The shot he'd taken just before everything blew up. George, slouched in his army jacket, backlit by the hazy afternoon sun, staring out into space. He looked like a ghost. Dylan deleted the photo without hesitation. The next day, Dylan skipped class. He sat in the university library for hours, flipping through digital archives, articles, even old military records. The more he read, the worse he felt. The 761st had fought for over 180 days straight, through freezing winters and entrenched towns. They'd liberated concentration camps. They'd suffered some of the highest casualty rates. And yet, when they came home, they weren't allowed to march in parades. Some were denied burial in veteran cemeteries. He read about George Carter's unit losing half its men at the Battle of the Bulge, and still, no one had taught him any of this. In his high school U.S. history class, they'd barely mentioned black soldiers at all. Maybe a footnote. Maybe. Dylan closed his laptop slowly and looked around the library. Everyone else was busy, typing, reading, scrolling. No one else was shaken. No one else was even aware. He wasn't just ignorant, he was part of the silence. That night, Dylan couldn't sleep. He tossed and turned in his dorm bed, haunted not just by what he didn't know, but by the realization that he'd turned a living piece of history into a joke. Just because George Carter didn't look like the heroes in textbooks, just because his body was bent and his eyes cloudy and his words slow, Dylan sat up in bed and opened his notebook. He scribbled one word across the top of the page, remember. Then underneath, a question. What does it take for someone not to be forgotten? 2 days later, Dylan returned to the park. George was there. Same bench, same jacket, same faraway look. But Dylan didn't have his camera this time. He had 2 cups of coffee and no idea what to say. He walked slowly toward the bench, heart pounding. When he reached it, he hesitated, then gently placed one of the cups on the armrest. George turned slightly. His expression didn't change. I'm sorry, Dylan said. Silence. I didn't know who you were, and that's no excuse, but I want to learn, if you'll let me. George looked at the coffee for a long moment. Then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Dylan sat, and for the first time, they spoke. The following Monday, Dylan skipped his usual morning class again. He wasn't ditching out of laziness this time. In fact, he'd never been more focused. He had 2 objectives: find everything he could about the 761st Tank Battalion, and more importantly, find the pieces of George Carter's story that history had left behind. The Charlotte Veterans Historical Archive was nestled in an old brick building near the courthouse. Faded flags hung in the windows, and a rusted bronze plaque by the front door read, "Lest we forget." Dylan pushed through the heavy doors and was immediately greeted by the scent of old paper, waxed floors, and time itself. Behind the front desk sat a thin elderly woman with short gray hair and a pair of oversized glasses that magnified her sharp, observant eyes. Her name tag read, Lena S. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice both warm and exact. Dylan took a breath. "I'm looking for anything on a World War II veteran named George H. Carter. He served in the 761st Tank Battalion." Her gaze narrowed slightly. "You said Carter?" "Yes, ma'am." She stood without another word and disappeared through a narrow hallway lined with file cabinets. After a few minutes, she returned holding a thick manila folder with a blue ribbon tied loosely around it. "This isn't in the public collection," she said softly, "but I remember the name." She laid the folder on the reading table like it was sacred. Dylan carefully untied the ribbon and opened it. Inside were yellowed documents, photos, and carbon-copied letters. At the very top, a grainy black and white photo of George, young, smiling in uniform, leaning on a tank nicknamed Ruthless Rose. Dylan's heart stuttered. "This was submitted to our records in the late 1980s, Lena explained. "His late wife sent it. Said he didn't want the attention, but she couldn't bear to let him be forgotten." Dylan turned the pages carefully. Commendation letters, field reports. One stood out. Recommendation for Distinguished Service Cross Private George H. Carter demonstrated extraordinary bravery under direct fire during the rescue of crewmates. Recommendation denied due to incomplete corroboration and internal disciplinary concerns. Dylan frowned. "What concerns?" Lena's mouth flattened. "He punched a superior officer." "What?" She nodded. "A white lieutenant accused his unit of cowardice during Bastogne. According to reports, Carter broke the man's nose, nearly got court-martialed, but the brass covered it up quietly." Dylan exhaled. "So he saved lives and got punished for standing up to racism." "Welcome to 1944, Lena said grimly. Later that day, Dylan sat at his dorm desk, scanning the documents and uploading copies to a folder titled Project Panther. His roommate glanced over. "Dude, you writing a war novel or something?" Dylan shook his head. "No, it's a documentary." He didn't elaborate. He didn't have to. By the end of the week, Dylan had read through every page, watched every available 761st interview online, and filled an entire notebook with scribbled notes, timelines, and questions. He wanted to be thorough. He needed to be. Because for the first time in his life, he felt like someone had handed him a responsibility bigger than himself. And it wore a fraying army jacket on a park bench. That Saturday, Dylan returned to the park. George was already there. Same bench, same jacket, same thermos of black coffee. But this time, when he saw Dylan approaching, he gave a small nod. Not quite a smile, but almost. "I found your picture," Dylan said as he sat down. "You were leaning on a tank. Ruthless Rose?" George's eyes flickered, then settled on Dylan with a quiet intensity. "That was her name," George said slowly. "Named her after a girl from Savannah who broke my heart." Dylan chuckled. "I have a few exes I could name a tank after." George's laughter rumbled low and dry. "That tank saved more lives than most people I knew." For the next hour, they talked. George described the freezing nights in Belgium, the smell of burning rubber, the sound a tank makes when it dies. He told Dylan about the time he snuck food to a group of starving civilians in France, and how one boy gave him a drawing of a panther that he'd kept in his pocket until the paper disintegrated. "It was the first time I felt seen," George said. "The kid didn't care what color I was, just that I helped." Dylan's voice caught. "Did anyone ever interview you? Formally, I mean." George shook his head. "They asked. Some agency from DC came by once in the 90s, but I turned them away." "Why?" George looked at him carefully. Then he spoke with the weight of years behind every word. Because back then, they only wanted the story, not the truth. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly in the small back room of the Southside Community Center. The walls were pale blue, chipped in the corners. A dusty American flag drooped in one corner, beside a corkboard pinned with faded flyers. Blood drives, job fairs, missing pets. Dylan sat across from George at a fold-out table. Between them, a tripod stood with a modest DSLR camera, Borrowed from the university media lab, a lavalier mic was clipped gently to George's collar, and a small Zoom recorder blinked red. Recording. Ready? Dylan asked, voice hushed. George shrugged. As I'll ever be. Dylan hesitated, then leaned forward, doing his best to steady the slight shake in his hands. State your full name for the record, please. George Henry Carter. And your date of birth? April 14th, 1925. A pause. George shifted in his chair. You want to know when I joined the war, don't you? Yes, Dylan nodded, but only if you're ready. George exhaled through his nose, long and slow. Then he looked up, not at Dylan, not at the camera, but at something behind it. Maybe a memory, maybe a ghost. I was drafted in 1943, out of Atlanta. They didn't expect us to make it through basic, didn't want us to, but the 761st, we were a different breed. What do you mean? George leaned back. We had something to prove, not just to the Army, to America. We were told we couldn't fight, that we weren't brave enough, smart enough, worth enough. They gave us secondhand tanks, no boots, no maps, but we came out swinging. He paused, eyes glinting. They called us the Black Panthers. Our motto was simple, come out fighting. And that's what we did. For the next hour, George's voice filled the room. He spoke of training in Louisiana, where the heat was nothing compared to the cold stares from white officers. He spoke of the endless drills, the nights spent cleaning engines with bleeding knuckles, the racism that smothered even their moments of pride. Then his tone shifted. The day I pulled Darnell and the others out, I remember the smell. Diesel, blood, and smoke. Our tank had taken a direct hit. The turret was jammed, fire everywhere. I was outside already, doing recon. I saw it happen. Dylan sat frozen, not even daring to breathe too loudly. I ran back, climbed up the side, burned my hands on the hull. Inside, Darnell was yelling. A piece of shrapnel had gone through his leg. Mason was unconscious. Gibbs was screaming for his mother. I don't remember thinking, just pulling. He rubbed his hands together as if they still felt the heat. I got them out, laid them in the snow, went back a third time, just as the tank collapsed in on itself. Silence. Dylan cleared his throat. They gave you a Bronze Star for that, right? George let out a dry chuckle. They mailed it to me. No ceremony, no photo, just a plain envelope and a little box. I still have it, somewhere. After the recording ended, Dylan sat back, heart pounding. I've never heard anything like that before, he said. George gave a half smile. That's because most folks don't ask. But they should. They won't, not unless someone makes them. The words lingered. Dylan stared at the camera. What if we could? George tilted his head. What do you mean? I mean, what if this becomes something bigger? Not just a school project. What if we tell your whole story? Not just battles and medals, but everything. The silence after, the weight you carried, all of it. George studied him for a long moment. Then, quietly, he said, If you're going to do that, then you need the whole truth. Dylan leaned in. I want it. You'll need to talk to people who were there, or close to it. Not many of us left, but I know a name or two. The nursing home in Baltimore was quiet. Too quiet. A nurse led Dylan down a corridor painted a cheerful peach, though the lighting gave it a dull amber hue. Every few steps, they passed an open door. Inside, a glimpse of oxygen tanks, quiet TVs, and lives nearing their final pages. He doesn't talk to many people, the nurse said over her shoulder. Only speaks when he wants to. Been sharp lately, though. Said your call sounded like the war knocking twice. Whatever that means. Dylan swallowed hard and nodded. Room 214. The door was cracked open. Inside, a frail man sat by the window, sunlight etching lines across his withered face. His skin was paper thin, his eyes milk-glazed but sharp beneath drooping lids. A framed photo sat on the bedside table. 3 black soldiers in full uniform, arms slung around one another, smiling into a long-vanished world. Mr. Tate? Dylan said softly. The man didn't look up. You brought a camera? Dylan blinked. Yes, but I wasn't planning to film right away. Tate tapped the windowsill. Good. Means you didn't come to perform. They talked for hours. Howard M. Tate had once been a corporal, assigned to assist the battalion's logistics officer, Captain McAllister, a strict and clean-shaven West Point graduate from Pennsylvania. Tate had managed supply lines, correspondences, and, most of all, people. I saw more than most, he said. Wasn't in the tanks, but I was always near the blast zone. Dylan listened closely, recording audio with a small mic clipped to his bag. He didn't interrupt much. Tate's voice, though gravelly, still held an edge of command. George Carter was the real deal. Cool under fire. Kept his men alive when better trained officers got theirs killed. But that made people nervous. Nervous how? Dillon asked. Tate gave him a look. Black soldier getting medals, respect from the French, loyalty from his unit, didn't sit right with some of the brass. He leaned closer. You want the truth? George was marked, not just because he was good, because he wasn't afraid to speak. Dillon opened his notebook. You're talking about the assault charge? Tate chuckled bitterly. You read that in a file? Yes, it said he struck a superior officer. Struck is a polite word. He broke the man's nose. Lieutenant Curtis, mean bastard. Called George a useless mule in front of his men. Said if he didn't stop acting white, he'd get reassigned to latrine detail. Dillon flinched. And George? Did what any man would do. Tate looked out the window. I saw it happen. I was 10 feet away. He didn't hit him to be violent. He hit him to survive. But that was enough. McAllister managed to bury it, said it was a disciplinary misunderstanding. But the higher-ups made a decision that day. What decision? Tate turned back, his voice low. That George Carter would never rise, no matter how many lives he saved. Later that evening, Dillon sat in his hotel room, headphones on, playing back the interview. He watched the sunrise creep through the blinds, chasing away the bruised shadows of his thoughts. Everything George had said, the mailed medal, the silence, the rejection, wasn't just bad luck. It was designed. A quiet erasure. The more Dillon uncovered, the more he realized he wasn't just making a film. He was building a record. One the world had denied. When he returned to Charlotte, Dillon stopped by the park first. George was there, as if time had been holding his place. How'd Baltimore treat you? George asked without turning. Dillon sat beside him. Howard Tate remembers everything. He told me about Lieutenant Curtis. A long pause. Then George muttered, that son of a bitch. I get it now, Dillon said. Why you didn't want to be interviewed back then. Why you kept it all quiet. George didn't respond at first. Then he said, almost gently, they wanted us to fight their war but disappear from their story. Some of us did. But not you? George chuckled. Didn't have the decency to die, I guess. Dillon looked at him. What if you did rise, though? What if this film made people see you, not as a side note, but as the story? George raised an eyebrow. I've never been anyone's headline, he said. Maybe it's time, Dillon replied. Dillon stared at the scanned document glowing on his laptop screen. The Department of Defense watermark stamped across the header did nothing to soften the words in the first paragraph. Operation Shard, February 1945. The 761st Tank Battalion was instructed to initiate an unsupported push beyond enemy lines under pretenses of providing forward reconnaissance. Internal strategy memos, see Appendix C, indicate the battalion's exposure was intended to divert enemy armor toward Bastone's eastern flank. He scrolled further. Projected casualty risk, 67%. Objective, tactical distraction, disposable unit designation. His breath caught. Disposable unit. They'd used the 761st as bait. He pushed his chair away from the desk, heart thudding. His hands trembled, not from shock, but fury. The war had taken so much from George and his brothers. But this was deliberate, calculated. He printed the file, tucked it into his backpack, and ran out the door. The next morning, the bench was empty. Dillon waited for 2 hours, cradling 2 cups of coffee as the clouds thickened above him. Still, no sign of George. He paced. He checked his phone. Finally, he texted, "You okay?" No response. He returned the next day. Same result. On the third day, he walked into Lorenzo's cafe, a block from the park, George's usual breakfast spot. The cashier, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes, recognized him immediately. "You're the one who sits with Mr. Carter, right?" "Yeah." "Have you seen him?" She hesitated. "Came in yesterday, looked off, didn't say a word, left without his food." Dillon left a 5 on the counter and sprinted back to the park. This time, George was there, sitting straighter than usual, hands folded, jacket buttoned to the top, the same photograph of his old crew resting on the bench beside him. "Hey," Dillon said, approaching slowly. George nodded once. "I've been looking for you." "I know." Dillon sat down carefully. He opened his bag, pulled out the printed report, and placed it between them without saying a word. George didn't touch it. "I wasn't going to keep this from you," Dillon said quietly, "but I wasn't sure if I should ask." George's eyes were distant. "I already knew." Dillon blinked. "You knew?" "I didn't have the papers, but I had the truth. We all did." His voice was hard, but not angry. You don't put a black tank battalion on point through a German-controlled forest in winter without air support unless you've made peace with losing them. Dylan swallowed. Why didn't you say anything in your letters? In your interviews? George turned to him. Because I wasn't trying to be a martyr. I was trying to survive. And maybe trying to forget. They sat in silence for a long time. Finally, Dylan asked, Do you want it in the film? George didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for the photograph and held it gently in his lap. That's Darnell. That's Gibbs. That's Mason. We were 17, 18, boys from Alabama, Ohio, Louisiana. They didn't go to war to be symbols. They went because they were told to, because they thought maybe if they fought hard enough, they'd finally be seen. He looked Dylan square in the eyes. If you tell that part of the story, you better be ready for the rest, not just what happened to us, but what didn't happen after. What didn't happen? The medals we never got, the jobs we were denied, the families we buried in silence, the nights we woke up screaming and no one called it PTSD because they didn't think black men had trauma, just anger. Dylan didn't speak. He couldn't. That night, Dylan began rewriting the voiceover script for his film. His hands hovered over the keyboard, uncertain. There were lines he wanted to say, sharp, angry, accusatory. But those weren't his words to say. Instead, he opened a new file and began transcribing George's quotes, verbatim. He wouldn't speak for George. He'd let George speak for himself. The lights dimmed. The low hum of conversation faded into silence as the screen flickered to life. Dylan sat in the back row of the university screening room, knees bouncing, heart hammering. He'd been up for 40 hours straight, checking audio levels, rendering files, correcting subtitles. The final version had been exported just 6 hours ago. Now it was out of his hands. On the stage below, George H. Carter stood at the podium, back straight, hat in hand, jacket pressed and adorned with a single ribbon, the Bronze Star, shining dully under the spotlights. He adjusted the mic. I served in World War II, he said, voice slow but clear. I was part of a unit they called the 701st Tank Battalion. Some of us called it the Black Panthers. Others called it a suicide assignment. A few chuckles, dry, unsure. George didn't smile. Most people in this room don't know our name. That's not your fault. That's history's fault. It remembered some of the blood, but none of the skin. He paused, glancing at the crowd. I'm not here for pity, and I sure ain't here for revenge. I'm here because this young man, he motioned to Dylan in the back, thought maybe the story still mattered, and maybe it does. A hush settled over the room. George stepped away. The screen went dark. Then the title card, The Last Panther. The film began with George's voice over black and white footage of tanks rolling through snow-blanketed Europe. Dylan had stitched together archival clips with personal letters and scanned photographs, overlaying everything with George's narration. They told us we were soldiers, but when we came home, they reminded us we were still black first. Gasps, murmurs. People leaned forward in their seats. Midway through the film, George described pulling his crew from a burning tank. The room was silent. Later, as the truth of Operation Shard emerged, how the 761st was knowingly sent into a death trap, several audience members audibly whispered, Jesus Christ. When the credits rolled, no one clapped at first. They simply sat, staring, absorbing. Then, slowly, applause erupted, tentative at first, then thunderous. George didn't rise. He just nodded once. Dylan felt his chest crack open. After the screening, people formed a line to speak with George. Some shook his hand. Others offered tearful apologies. One professor wept openly, promising to rewrite his WWII syllabus. A man in a dark blazer with a veteran's pin approached quietly. You don't remember me, he said to George, but I saw you in 46. You walked off that train in Atlanta, and they made you carry your own bags. I was 10. I never forgot. George stared at him for a moment, then said, Neither did I. Outside the theater, reporters waited. Dylan blinked as camera flashes struck him like lightning. Are you the filmmaker? Yes. Did you expect this level of response? No. Do you think this will finally put the 761st on the map? He hesitated. I hope it puts them in the hearts first. Later that night, his inbox exploded. Festival invitations, historical archives requesting copies, professors from DC and New York asking to screen it in their classrooms. But one message stood out. From National African American Veterans Memorial Commission. Subject: National Recognition Proposal. Sachet George H. Carter. Message: We were moved by the film. We'd like to formally honor Sanatan and Namar Carter and the 761st in Washington, D.C. this November. Full military honors, media coverage, and a commemorative plaque. Dylan stared at it for a long time, then forwarded it to George. The next morning, George said no. They sat on the park bench, sun breaking through the branches above, leaves scattered like metals across the ground. I appreciate it, George said, truly, but I ain't going. Dylan was stunned. Why not? George sipped his coffee. They had 75 years to do it. Took a college kid with a borrowed camera to make them remember. But that's why it's important now, because people are remembering. George shook his head. I didn't do this to stand on a stage. I did it so those who can't stand anymore get remembered. You want to honor us? Make sure this film keeps playing. Make sure they teach it in schools. I don't need a plaque. Dylan fell quiet. But, George added, looking sideways, if you go, I wouldn't mind a picture of the plaque, if it happens. That was as close to yes as Dylan was going to get. Dylan hadn't expected the woman on the phone to sound so young. Her name was Renee Walton, a graduate student in Chicago. She tracked him down through the university website after watching The Last Panther during a virtual symposium on underrepresented war histories. My grandfather was Charles Walton. He served in the 761st, and I think he knew George Carter. Dylan sat upright. George never mentioned him. Renee hesitated. There's a reason. I just found a box of his things in our attic, letters, photos. Some of them talk about a falling out. A week later, Dylan was on a train to Chicago, backpack heavy with his camera and recorder. The city rolled past in gray and silver as he reviewed the interview outline in his head, but something kept tugging at him, an unshakable question. What did George not tell me? When he arrived, Renee met him at a small cafe near the university. She was in her mid-20s, sharp-eyed and reserved, clutching a weathered shoebox like it contained radioactive truth. He never talked about the war, she said as they sat. Not to my mother, not to me, but these. She opened the lid and passed Dylan a stack of thin envelopes, each yellowed and addressed in curling cursive. To Ruth Carter, Charlotte, N.C. Dylan's breath hitched. George's wife, Renee nodded. They were never sent. Back at Renee's apartment, they read. Each letter was dated between late 1945 and early 1946. Charles Walton wrote from various veterans' facilities across Georgia and Illinois, never staying in one place too long. His tone ranged from regretful to accusatory. One line stood out. I told him to let it go, that no one was going to punish Curtis, but he wouldn't stop. He said silence was worse than betrayal. He said if I didn't stand up, I wasn't his brother anymore. Another letter. Ruth, if he never forgives me, I understand, but I need someone to know I was scared. Not of the Germans, of the men in our own ranks, the ones who wore our flag but hated our skin. Dylan's hands trembled as he turned the last letter over. Tell him I never stopped believing in him. I just stopped believing we'd ever win. Dylan stared at the box for a long moment. George never told me any of this, not a word. Renee looked down. Do you think he knew the letters existed? Maybe. Maybe that's why he never mentioned Charles. There was pain in both their voices, grief for a history too heavy for those who lived it, and too broken for those who inherited it. Renee spoke again. I think you should take the letters. I've read them. I don't want them to disappear again. Back in Charlotte, Dylan sat across from George on the usual bench. Leaves crunched under their feet. A cold breeze whispered between the trees. I met someone, Dylan said quietly. Renee Walton, Charles Walton's granddaughter. George's eyes narrowed. She found letters addressed to Ruth. He wrote them after the war. George looked away. He said you called him a coward. George didn't answer. Dylan reached into his backpack and gently placed the stack of letters between them. George stared at them like they were landmines. I never read them, George murmured. But I always knew. Why didn't you talk about him? George's jaw tightened. Because I trusted him. We bled together. But when it came time to speak up, he turned away. That kind of silence you never forget. Dylan was quiet. George slowly reached for the top letter and opened it. He read it, word by word, lips pressed tight. Then another. And another. His hands shook by the fourth. When he finished, he looked at Dylan. He was scared, George said. We all were, but I carried their voices. Alone. That's what broke me. Dylan swallowed. Would you forgive him now? George didn't answer right away. Finally, he whispered, I already did, just didn't know how to say it. That evening, Dylan filmed George reading one of Charles Walton's letters aloud. His voice cracked in places, but he didn't stop. At the end of the segment, he looked directly into the lens and said, some of us never got to finish the sentences we started in war, but maybe the next generation will learn how to write them better. The package arrived in a plain cardboard box, sealed with layers of clear tape. On the shipping label, to Dylan Callahan, Charlotte, NC, from Emily Parson, Montgomery, AL. Dylan opened it slowly, careful not to tear the contents. Inside, wrapped in old cloth and smelling faintly of dust and cedar, was a vintage 8mm film reel. There was also a note. This belonged to my great-uncle, Roy Parson. He was a field technician with the 761st, assigned to communications, but had a camera with him through most of the European campaign. We never watched this reel. Grandpa always said it was too raw. Maybe now's the time. Dylan stared at the spool of fragile black celluloid in his hands. If this reel really showed what Emily believed, it could be the only known footage of the 761st at Bastogne, of George, of his crew, of the moment. He made calls, lots of them, and finally booked a restoration appointment with a private media lab downtown. For 2 hours, he sat in the small viewing room while the technician carefully threaded the film through a digitizer. The screen flickered, colors washed in sepia and black. The reel began. Snow-covered roads, tanks rumbling forward, faces blurred by motion and time. Then, a flash of something unmistakable. Ruthless Rose, George's tank. Dylan leaned forward. There they were, George, Darnell, Mason, Gibbs, young, alive, laughing. Suddenly the scene shifted. Smoke, chaos, a tank burning in the background, soldiers running. Then the camera jolted, shaky, frantic, but caught a moment of staggering clarity. George Carter hauling a limp body out of the flames. Another, then another. A fourth attempt, he vanished inside the smoke. The frame froze for a second, then cut. The screen went black. The technician stopped the reel. That's the end. Dylan sat still, throat tight. He'd just witnessed the moment George became a legend, without knowing anyone had ever seen it. That night, Dylan brought the digitized footage to George. They sat in silence as the grainy film played on a small laptop screen in the community center's back room. When the frozen frame of George carrying Mason out of the tank appeared, George leaned in slightly. He didn't blink. He didn't breathe. When the screen went black, Dylan whispered, "You never told me it looked like that." George sat still for a long moment. Then he said, "I didn't think it mattered anymore." "It does." George finally looked at him. "No one was supposed to remember us. That's why we were chosen. A suicide squad no one would mourn." "But now they will," Dylan said. "They already are." George's eyes misted. "That moment, I was just trying to save my brothers. I didn't think anyone would ever see it." The footage sparked a new surge of interest. Veteran organizations requested permission to screen the reel. Historians reached out. A regional PBS documentary team contacted Dylan asking for collaboration. But perhaps the most unexpected email came from the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. They wanted to feature the footage in a new WWII exhibit titled Invisible Valor. Dylan forwarded the request to George. This time, he said yes. Weeks later, Dylan and George traveled to D.C. together. George wore his full uniform, the one he hadn't touched in decades. A tailor had cleaned and adjusted it. It fit surprisingly well. The museum staff treated him like royalty. When the lights dimmed for the exhibit's private preview, George stood beneath a massive projection of himself in the frozen forest of Bastogne, pulling his men out of hell. For the first time, Dylan saw George smile fully, not the half-shrug grin, but something full of weight and release. "You ever think you'd end up in a museum?" Dylan whispered. George chuckled. "I thought I'd end up buried in a snowbank." The records office was located in a quiet wing of the National Archives complex, not far from the Capitol. The hallway smelled faintly of old paper and lemon polish. As George and Dylan followed the archivist, a short man with silver hair and horn-rimmed glasses, they passed walls lined with photographs. Eisenhower shaking hands with soldiers, telegrams from Normandy, dog-eared field maps annotated in pencil. "I've been here 27 years, the archivist said softly. "Never seen something like this turn up under a misfiled code." He led them into a glass-walled consultation room and laid a single manila folder on the table. No one's touched it since it was found. We'll scan it after you're done. But I think it's yours, Sergeant Carter. George's hand hovered over the folder. Then, slowly, he opened it. Inside was a single page of stationery, yellowed, official, bearing the insignia of the 3rd U.S. Army Headquarters. Typed in precise, slightly faded strokes. To Colonel Paul Bates. From General George S. Date, March 8, 1945. Sir, the performance of the 761st Tank Battalion during the past several weeks has been nothing short of exemplary. They have held the line with bravery and precision, executing tasks under conditions that would have broken many of our most seasoned white divisions. Their conduct under fire at Bastogne, in particular, demands commendation. I have personally witnessed acts of valor from these men that rival anything I've seen in my military career. If this letter reaches you, I urge that each man under your command be recognized with full honors, without prejudice or delay. These men are not just Negro tankers. They are American soldiers, and they have come out fighting. G.S. Patton, George's lips pressed into a thin line. Dillon waited, afraid to even breathe. After a moment, George read the final lines aloud, his voice quiet. They are American soldiers, and they have come out fighting. He folded the letter carefully and set it on the table. The room was silent, except for the humming of fluorescent lights overhead. Dillon finally spoke. They buried it, didn't they? The archivist nodded. Most likely. No record of this letter ever reaching Colonel Bates. Might have been intercepted by someone who didn't want it seen. George let out a long breath. It wouldn't have mattered. Not then. But it matters now, Dillon said. George didn't answer right away. Instead, he stood up and looked out the glass wall toward the rows of filing cabinets, thousands upon thousands of lives reduced to boxes and paper. 79 years, he whispered. Later that afternoon, a small press gathering was held just outside the museum's library. A staff historian introduced George and presented a high-resolution copy of the letter on a mounted plaque. Reporters asked questions, snapped photos, but George spoke only once. We fought, we bled, and for a long time we were forgotten. But I didn't do any of this to be remembered. I did it so the truth would outlive me. Someone in the back called out, "Do you forgive the Army for the way they treated you?" George paused, then answered, "I don't think it's about forgiveness anymore. I think it's about responsibility." That evening, George and Dillon sat together at the Lincoln Memorial. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a golden hue over the reflecting pool. People passed them by, tourists, veterans, children on field trips. Funny, George said, nodding toward Lincoln's statue. He freed us, but it took another 100 years for anyone to call us equal, and another 100 after that for someone to call us heroes. Dillon turned to him. You were always heroes. George gave a soft, tired smile. You made people believe that. No, Dillon said. You did. I just hit record. The lawn was immaculate, deep green and trimmed with precision that bordered on reverence. Rows of white folding chairs lined the south side of the White House grounds, facing a small stage beneath the American flag, which fluttered in a cool November breeze. George H. Carter adjusted the knot of his tie slowly. He hadn't worn a full suit in nearly a decade. It still fit, barely. The bronze star pinned to his lapel caught the sunlight like a whisper from the past. You look sharp, Dillon said beside him, straightening his own blazer nervously. George raised an eyebrow. I look old. You look like a man who made history. George snorted. I look like a man who waited 80 years for a thank you. As guests arrived, politicians, generals, journalists, Dillon spotted familiar faces. Several professors who had helped vet the film. Renee Walton, seated in the second row, held a folded flag in her lap. Even Howard Tate had made the journey, wheeled in by his niece, eyes sharp behind heavy glasses. Dillon set up a small camera on a tripod near the back. He wouldn't miss a second. Then the hush fell. The president stepped to the podium, flanked by military officials in full dress. Today, we honor not just a man, but a battalion that changed the course of history without ever being fully written into it. The words echoed across the lawn, amplified by a PA system and recorded by every major news network. But Dillon wasn't listening to the president. He was watching George. George sat motionless, eyes fixed ahead, not blinking, not smiling. His hand rested on his thigh, thumb tracing the seam of his pants. a soldier's habit, long outliving the war. It is our honor to posthumously award the Presidential Unit Citation to the 761st Tank Battalion, and it is our greater honor to do so in the presence of the battalion's last living member, Sergeant George H. Carter. Applause burst like a wave. George stood slowly. The president descended from the podium and approached him. They shook hands. A military aide handed George a velvet box. Inside, the metal gleamed bright and heavy. Dillon caught it all on film. But what moved him more was the look in George's eyes. Not pride, not satisfaction, just peace. After the ceremony, George was ushered through rounds of interviews, handshakes, and photographs. He answered questions with humility and brevity, deflecting credit like a trained boxer slipping punches. "You're a national hero," one reporter said. "I'm a mechanic from Atlanta," George replied. "But you changed the way this country remembers its past." George gave a tired smile. "I just reminded it who it forgot." When the crowd began to thin, George leaned toward Dillon. "Let's go." "We still have the press conference." "I said let's go." Dillon packed up the camera and followed George past the gates, past the guards, past the wait of ceremony. They got into a black sedan provided by the museum, and George gave the driver an address in Arlington. Not a hotel, a cemetery. The Arlington National Cemetery was quiet that afternoon. The wind moved through the rows of white headstones like a slow breath. George walked slowly, his cane tapping against the concrete walkway. Dillon followed silently, hands deep in his coat pockets. They stopped in front of a small section marked for WWII veterans. There, side by side, PFC Mason Ford, 1924 to 1945, CPL Darnell Price, 1925 to 1945, PVT Eugene Gibbs, 1926 to 1945. George stood still for a long time. Then he removed his hat. He crouched slowly, not easy at his age, and placed the Presidential Unit Citation medal box gently in the grass between the three markers. "They wouldn't have let you stand on that lawn today," he said softly, "but you should have." Dillon swallowed the lump in his throat. George continued, voice steady. "We came out fighting. We just didn't all come home." He stood again, wincing slightly. Dillon offered a hand, but George waved it off. As they turned to leave, George added, "Tell the story right, son. Make sure it ends where it's supposed to." It was a Thursday morning when the sun rose gently over Halston Park, washing the sidewalk in pale gold. Birds chirped from the branches above, and a few early joggers traced the winding paths in silence. Everything looked the same as it had for years, except the bench was empty. For the first time in months, George Carter wasn't sitting there with his jacket folded neatly beside him, sipping black coffee from a tin thermos and watching the day arrive. He had passed away in his sleep the night before. Peacefully, they said, in his own bed beside the wooden box that held his medals and his late wife's letters. The folded flag from the museum sat on the shelf above his headboard. The bronze star was still pinned to his blazer, clean, pressed, and waiting. The news spread quickly. Within hours, Dillon's phone lit up with messages from news stations, veteran organizations, museum curators, even former students who had seen The Last Panther in class. But Dillon didn't respond right away. He drove to the park. It was still early, just a few elderly walkers and a maintenance worker sweeping leaves near the pond. Dillon walked slowly down the path, heart heavy, until he reached the bench. The wooden plaque George had fastened to its back just weeks before still shone in the morning light. Sergeant George H. Carter, 761st Tank Battalion, come out fighting. Someone had left a single white rose beneath it. Dillon sat down, not bothering to wipe the dew from the wood. For the first time since they'd met, the silence felt unbearable. 3 days later, the community held a memorial service in the park. It wasn't huge. George wouldn't have wanted that. But the people who mattered came. Renee Walton flew in from Chicago. Howard Tate was wheeled up front, hat clutched in trembling hands. Several local veterans in uniform stood at attention. Children from a nearby middle school carried small American flags. A brass quartet played softly. The pastor said a few words. Then Dillon stepped forward. He cleared his throat, holding a folded sheet of paper. But after a moment, he put it away. "I was going to read something," he said, "but I think George would rather I spoke from the heart." He looked around at the crowd. Faces young and old, strangers and friends, all gathered for a man most of the world had only just begun to know. "When I met George, I thought I was doing a project, telling a story. But the truth is, I was being educated. He taught me that silence isn't the absence of history, it's the evidence of it. He glanced at the bench behind him. He sat right there, day after day, with a story no one asked him to tell, until one day someone finally did. And now he'll never have to tell it again. He paused, because now we will. After the service, Dylan placed a small brass canister beneath the bench, sealed tight against weather, lined with felt. Inside, a thumb drive containing The Last Panther. He didn't want it buried in some museum vault or forgotten on a hard drive. He wanted it there, beside George. So that, in some way, the story never left him. Weeks passed, then months. Winter came, and children began leaving wreaths and small paper tank drawings at the bench. A local artist painted a mural nearby, George in uniform, standing in front of Ruthless Rose with the words, "Not a footnote, a foundation." The film began showing in classrooms across the country. Textbooks started referencing the 761st. Dylan received invitations to speak at universities, history panels, and veterans roundtables. He never went alone. He always brought the film, always brought George. 1 year later, on the first anniversary of George's passing, Dylan returned to the bench. This time, he wasn't alone. A group of high school students from Charlotte's West Side Charter stood around him, notebooks in hand, bundled in jackets against the cold. Their teacher had assigned them to watch The Last Panther. Now they were here to ask questions. One boy raised his hand. Was he really the last one? Dylan nodded. Yeah, the last surviving member of the 761st. The boy looked at the plaque. Then who carries it now? Dylan smiled. You do. Final words. History is not just what we record, it's what we choose to remember. Sergeant George Carter didn't fight to be remembered, but we remember him anyway, because he taught us how to fight for the truth and how to live with courage even after the war ends. Closing narration from the extended edition of The Last Panther.